So in the last few years, sourdough has become increasingly popular, and I've been very hesitant to try to jump on board and do it. I've certainly had some hesitations, and I figured it was going to be a huge time commitment, but we had a lovely neighbor who kept giving us some of her discard for us to kind of play around with, and eventually Cody talked me into just trying to keep some of it alive, so I did. We've been experimenting with it a little bit, and I think we finally found something that actually works that I'm happy with to kind of keep on going with it. So I figured I would kind of show you guys my process, kind of what I'm doing with it now, and then we also need to make a loaf of bread for dinner tomorrow. But before all of that happens, I need to change out the jar because it's looking a little gross. So first I'm going to start by just pouring off how much of this starter I need to, well, I don't know. Is this called starter? I'm not really sure. I don't really know what it's called. I don't know the correct terminology of all of this, but I need to pour enough of this stuff into my jar to make a starter for a loaf of bread, basically. So the system that I've worked with is I do 60 grams of everything. 60 grams of starter, 60 grams of water, 60 grams of flour, and for me that uses, or it ends up with the least amount of discard in the end. So my measurements are not always 100% spot on, but I get it pretty close. And then I've just got my new jar that I'm going to pour the rest of it into. And I'm going to do the same thing, just do a 1:1:1 ratio of starter to water to flour. There's about 160 grams in that one now. That was a terrible pour. So that's pretty much it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one, put it back in the fridge, and then I don't feed this one every single time. What I do is I wait until there's a lot less of the starter in there before I actually feed it again. Otherwise, I just let it live in the fridge full time, take it out. I'll take out a little bit so I can make my bread, and then this will just go back in the fridge. But once the jar starts to get a little gross looking, then I like to switch it over. So this can just go live in there and be forgotten about. And then this I'm going to go set over by the wood stove overnight, and then tomorrow morning I'll mix it up into the actual dough for the bread. And I've never actually had it overflow on me yet, but it has gotten really close. So I always just make sure that I have it on a plate, and then I just have a really loose lid just to sit on top of it. it's a little bit later the next day than I was hoping for. I wanted to get this done a little bit earlier, but it's cooler in our house, so it was taking a bit longer than I had hoped for it to rise. Ideally, I'd probably want it to get a little bit closer to the top of this jar, but I think it's good enough. It's still nice and bubbly in there, so we're gonna go ahead and start mixing up our loaf of bread, which this, you guys can see that, this is what I'm going off of. Pretty simple. My goal in all of this is to have the least amount of waste with the discard. I basically don't have any discard the way that I'm doing this right now. And then my goal is also just to do as little bit of a time commitment as possible. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to mix the dough in my bowl. I'm gonna let it sit for about 30 to 60 minutes. And then at that point I will shape it, kind of do the thing where you're creating the crust, shape it to how I want. And then I will put it in my Dutch oven and let it do its bulk rise in that Dutch oven already, so that when it has at least doubled in size, I do not touch it again. I basically only touch it that one time after mixing it before I bake it. So that is kind of the game plan. So I don't really worry too much about being exact on the measurements. I'm really using the scale to get a general idea of what I'm doing, and I'm hoping in the future, after doing this for a while, I'll kind of just know by feel. So if I'm off by a couple grams, I'm really not worried about it. I get the majority. I get the majority of like the wet mixing done with the spatula, and then I just switch to my hand because it's just a lot easier. And I pretty much just go until it's fully combined together. So it's not 100% mixed together, but it's pretty close. Sometimes it ends up drier, sometimes it ends up wet and sticky. But either way, I still think it ends up just fine in the end. It's getting a little bit colder outside, so our wood stove is going pretty good right now, so I'm not surprised it's a little bit drier today. So I'm just gonna put one of these flat silicone mats on top, and then I'm gonna go set it back over by the wood stove and then come back to it in about an hour, or just whenever I happen to remember it. Now, there's not much left in this jar, so I do think doing about 60 grams works out pretty well because you don't end up with a lot of extra. But basically all I do with this is I just take it and I add it back into the stuff that I keep in the fridge. I just combine it back up together just to use later for more loaves of bread. So our dough has sat and risen for a few hours now. So that is what it's looking like. It's definitely doubled in size. I don't even score it or anything. I leave it just like this with the lid on, and then I put it in the oven. So I set the oven to 375, and that is the only temperature I leave it at. I leave it covered for at least half an hour, check to see what it's looking like, and then I uncover it for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and that's about it. Doing that and leaving the lid on a little bit more, I find gives a softer crust, which we actually kind of prefer. So that's what I do with that. And half the time, like right now, I don't even preheat the oven because I don't remember to do it. So I'm just going to set the oven at 375 and put it in right away. So I don't think that looks too bad at all. It's a little bit softer because we keep the lid on the Dutch oven so we don't get quite as hard of a crust. It's still got a chewy, hard crust, just a little bit softer than if you were to leave that lid off for longer in the baking process. I know that there's so many ways that you can make sourdough and how you treat your starter and do the discard and all of that. But we just kind of experimented around a little bit and found what worked for us. Our main goals really were just as simple, quick, easy as possible, as low maintenance as possible. Throughout the day, we have a lot going on and there's a lot of spontaneous things that happen to come up, and I didn't really want to be tied to trying to keep something going every single day. So keeping it in the fridge for sometimes even a whole week and not doing anything with it works pretty well for us. I also really like doing it the way we're doing it because we really don't have any discard. Keeping it in the fridge, just taking out what I need. It's pretty much just I use it completely for bread. And then whenever it gets really low, I just feed whatever's in that main jar in the fridge to keep it going. But I'm not finding myself needing to use discard on a daily basis. I'm not needing to come up with hundreds of different recipes for what to possibly use it for so that I'm not wasting it. That was a really big thing for me with sourdough. And so I think this works out pretty well. We have tried a couple discard recipes. We've done waffles a few times in our cast iron waffle maker, and that turned out really good. But the same thing, we can just take it out of the fridge and just use it to mix up a batch of waffles. We don't really need to specifically make discard, I guess, or however that works. I'm not really sure. The friend that I got this starter from initially, she does a really good job with mixing like different flavors into her doughs a lot. So I think eventually we'll probably try doing that. But right now we've just kept it all plain as can be, super simple. So going forward, I think that's the only thing that I'm really looking at changing with this whole sourdough thing is just adding some extra little flavors and fun additives inside of it. I just figured I would share my process and kind of what works for us.